Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we jump ahead some decades and continents to Whiteland's house, King's Road, Chelsea, London, 1966. This is now recent history to Saroyan, writing Places Where I've Done Time only 3 years later in 1969. His daughter, Lucy, was living in London at the houses of friends. Today, we might call it couch surfing. She didn't have a permanent place of her own and was trying to figure out the next steps in her life, age 20. Being the child of celebrities, she had grown up with many interesting social connections, and some of them welcomed her into their London homes in 1966. She house-sat, babysat, and was generally a professional houseguest for a little while. This disgusted William, who would not indulge in the generosities of friends, and felt this looked more like mooching than being friendly. Lucy didn't see it this way. In his biography, A Daring Young Man, John Leggett wrote of Saroyan, "The moment the bridge of charity was extended, Bill's self-sufficiency was threatened. A friend in need itself was unthinkable." Saroyan was alarmed that his child would do such a thing, so in a rage he rented a flat in the Whitelands house to give her an appropriate home in London. Eventually, Arm also moved into the Whitelands house. William says that for 8 weeks they lived together and talked at all hours of the day. By this point, relationships had been strained for years since his final divorce from Carol in 1952. Carol had remarried and had another child with Walter Matthau. To William, this was a chance, maybe his final one, to reconnect with his children. The Whitelands house grounds were originally, and perhaps ironically for Lucy, a college for women. The house was originally built in 1772 as a girls' boarding school. In 1842, it became a women's teaching college. It was demolished and rebuilt in 1935 as an apartment building. This is the expensive flat that Saroyan was renting for the benefit of Lucy, though he had recently been at his flat in Paris. In 1983's William Saroyan, The Man and the Writer Remembered, edited by Leo Hamelian, Gillisan Haroyan's interview with Lucy shines a light on this time period. She had been staying with family friends, the Rises, Betsy and Carol. She considered them second parents, removed from the drama and intensity of her relationship with her own parents. Carol Rise was a Czech-British filmmaker. Betsy was formerly married to Gene Kelly and knew William from his early Broadway days, when she was a dancer and blossoming actress. In her autobiography, In Memory of All That, she wrote of Saroyan, "He was a big, handsome, jovial man, about 33, with a loud voice and a sharp and sensitive eye. He seemed to bring the Pacific Ocean with him when he entered a room. After about an hour of the usual talk and argument and jokes, he turned to me and said, 'Are you an actress?' I wasn't prepared for his question. There was one of those moments of silence into which I said, 'Yes.' Everyone looked at me. Someone said, 'Betsy, what are you saying?' 'I am,' I insisted. 'I know I'm a dancer, but I speak a line in a Broadway show, so I'm an actress now, too.' They all laughed, but Saroyan said, 'I want you to be the ingenue in my new play. Where do you live? I'll send it to you tomorrow.' When he'd left, Jean and Dick told me gently not to take it too seriously. He says that kind of thing to every taxi driver. The next morning, I was called from the front desk of the Henry Hudson Hotel. There was a package for me. I dashed down to get it. It was the manuscript of The Beautiful People. There was a note from Saroyan to call him at the Great Northern Hotel after I'd read it. It's no surprise that Betsy would have wanted to pay that generosity forward to Lucy, whom she adored, but William preferred to bestow rather than ask for help himself. Her couch surfing made him overwhelmed by a sense of shame and profound disappointment and anger. I told her it was not permissible for her to accept the kindness of friends. Falling into such a pattern was harmful to the character. It was bad procedure. Lucy said of this period, "Any time I spent with Papa, any sort of space always helped. That was sort of my stepping off into my own life period when I was living in London. It was a big help. Papa taught me. he was somewhat critical of me at the time because he thought I was permitting myself to be people's houseguest and to receive their graciousness and generosity without really having the means to repay them. In many ways, I think he was right. It was an indulgent period of mine, and I think he gave me perspective on how to hold my own. It always helped to spend time with him. He was a force to be reckoned with. Saroyan often had harsh words for Lucy, for whom he had high expectations, and she, in turn, worshipped and defended him and was hit hard when he was critical of her. Leggett titles a chapter in his biography, Whiteland's House, 1961 to 1968, a difficult period that he apparently felt was best summed up by the brief experience in the Whitelands house in 1966. In it, he describes how Lucy was trying to kick off her acting career, so William cast her in Hello Out There, her theatrical debut, though it did not reach wide audiences. The Whitelands house episode and most of the 1960s were a tumultuous time for the Saroyans. It should be noted that Aram and Carol did not approve of the William Saroyan Foundation authorizing Leggett's biography, and denied their cooperation. This was part of the aftermath of William's disinheritance upon his death and a prolonged battle over his will, archives, and copyright. Early in the decade, Carol had sued William for child support, and their relationship was legal and acrimonious thereafter. He resented that his children still had a relationship with their mother, who he felt betrayed him, and the many layers of frustration between all members of the family built up in New York, California, Chicago, London, Paris, Fresno, all over the world. Leggett's chapter on this time period has a tone of general dismay and failure. In Saroyan's chapter, In Places Where I've Done Time, he is more ambivalent about the outcome, ending the chapter with, "We talked for 8 full weeks, and then broke up. Perhaps it helped. I don't know." Though Saroyan had been a freethinker and even considered an early beatnik, his views on family and work ethics were traditional and rather conservative. Lucy explained, "He was shy, and he was thwarted by certain feelings he had about Aram, and that Aram was his son. He was Armenian, he was old-fashioned in a way. He was very patriarchal. He had great aspirations and hopes for Aram, and I think that their communication was very different from ours. Ours was a little easier. The pressure wasn't on me as strongly as it was on Aram." This style butts heads with the culture of the late 1960s, when his children were exploring the realms of civil rights, mind expansion, and the search for identity in a troubling world. To William, the lack of a career for his children in their 20s was vexing. He felt Aram should be better established in his chosen career, and that Lucy wasn't cut out for acting, though she tried to make it happen. She also never married and never had children, 2 concepts that struck William as inappropriate for a young woman. His own dream was to have a large family, but that too was never realized. The two generations, one born in the early 1900s and one born in the middle of the century, were clashing all over America, and the Saroyans were no exception. After William and Carol split, he would take the children for summers in Europe, and they would spend good times together that often soured by the end, but they were used to these bursts of life spent together over the course of a month or 2. Their time in London was indeed to be their last together as a unit, as Aram left to build his own family and Lucy pushed to find her place in her world among friends and lovers. Saroyan spent a good portion of his time in London gambling, as he had done in the past, and just when he would make a little money to pay his debts, he found that once again he was underwater with gambling. In the 1960s, his writing, too, was getting more challenging to sell. Though he was proud of his early memoirs, The Bicycle Rider in Beverly Hills, and Here Comes, There Goes You Know Who, they weren't money makers and did not receive critical acclaim. He also struggled to have his plays produced during this time. He never truly recovered from these painful years, but continued to write and seek publishers throughout the 1970s, committed to his career, knowing that his talent and experience were still worth money. He was gambling every night at Crockford's and at the Colony Club, in an area he knew well from his army days in London, and Eric Steiner's casino called Pair of Shoes. He spent $20,000 in 3 months in London. His times in Europe were always spent gambling, and this is a main topic in Here Comes, There Goes You Know Who. But at times, he believed that losing money made him need to write to make it back, and that kept him busy and fruitful. This chapter comes off as mildly frustrating to Saroyan. He was having trouble understanding his children, which of course later critics would point out as ironic since he was known for writing and getting into the heads of youthful fictional characters. To some extent, this comes back to his existence in two socioeconomic worlds, one of the wealthy, famous celebrity, and one of poverty in Fresno and San Francisco, which affected him deeply. His children grew up in New York and Los Angeles, attending progressive private schools and being exposed to stars and their children their whole lives. This was the complete opposite of Saroyan's rough childhood, and he never really figured out how to empathize with the conditions he and Carol had created for their children. And on top of all that, he had an image of childhood suspended in the pre-teen years, when he believed people had the most freedom to create, untethered by the world. As his children aged, they lost that freedom and innocence of early childhood, and he longed for that vicariously and for his children to be arrested at that stage of innocence. This, of course, could not be. He expressed disappointment whenever they proved they were in a new stage of life. Readers would later learn the toll this took on Arm and Lucy, especially through Arm's Last Rites, a book about his final days with his father, published in 1982. This is another dip into the darker side of Saroyan's life, which he included to illustrate the ups and downs of living. He has joyful chapters and he has mournful chapters, but he is laying it all out for the reader to some extent. By 1972, he was almost exclusively writing memoirs, digging into the good times and bad to provide a full story for his legacy, one that was to be maintained by the William Saroyan Foundation, which he established in 1966. It's a tough chapter, but it's full of his way of thinking, which is invaluable to his fans and researchers. Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.